Be warned, the following contains graphic descriptions and situations not suitable to all audiences. In addition to the usual fare, this program frequently discusses manipulation, violence, death, sex, negative stereotypes, and a surprising amount of regurgitation. Listener discretion is advised. On a quiet evening in May of 1923, a group of curious guests gathered in a fashionable parlor on Lime Street. They were there for a home circle, an informal seance of sorts. Only the guests were far from ordinary. They were a collection of Boston's finest, members of society, prominent physicians, and Harvard's academic elite. With bellies full of delicacies and glasses of bootleg gin, the group giggled like naughty school children as their host prompted them to take their seats around the table. He even growled at a couple of them to take this seriously. But it was Dr. Crandon, the highest and mightiest of them all, so he had to take it with a grain of salt. One at a time, the group took turns asking questions into the air. "Which railway stock should I buy?" asked one guest. "Will my sister's beau finally ask for her hand?" asked another. Followed by another. "How long will I be forced to drink this cheap swill?" His question made the room erupt in laughter, as much for his commentary on prohibition as to the color from Crandon's face. The silly stuffed shirt really needed to calm down. "What was that?" asked a guest, seated next to the doctor and his wife. The group grew quiet and waited. Then it happened again. There was no doubt. The table definitely tilted. As if they'd been looking for a reason to do so, Crandon clutched the table and barked at each of his guests to leave the room one at a time. With each exit, the table continued its ghostly movements, until at last it fell to rest in its original position. The minute Crandon's wife, Mina, stood up to leave. I'm Jennifer Beck, and this is The Haunted Hustle. Much remained unchanged in the decades that followed the birth of spiritualism. Its female practitioners found themselves in much the same situation, forced to navigate the same social and economic challenges as their predecessors. Like most roles women hold, mediums were expected to be all things to all people, minister and sage to their customers, a lab rat for science, and a flawless champion for the spiritualist community. The pretty blonde flapper that came to be known as Marjorie Crandon was no exception. If anything, her stakes were much higher. But when one takes on the world's greatest debunker, they often are. Mina Marguerite Stinson was born in Princeton, Ontario in 1888. Facts about her early life are sparse, but we know she moved to Boston when she was 16. She worked as an actress and a secretary of a local church, and there she married a grocer named Earl Rand when she was in her 20s. Then tragedy struck when her older brother Walter died in a train crash in 1911. Not much is known about Walter either, including how he lived, what he was like, or even if the two were very close. Between the lack of public records and Mina's later attempts to distort the narrative, much remains murky. But the death doesn't appear to have affected her relationship with Rand. The couple welcomed a son a few years later. For all outward appearances, the marriage seems to have been a happy one. That is, until Mina came under the care of Dr. Leroy Crandon, a prestigious surgeon renowned as much for his medical skills as his wealth and privilege. Known for his revolutionary surgical practices, which bear a striking similarity to today's endoscopic techniques, Most historians presume Mina had a bout of appendicitis and Crandon was her attending physician. Their affair must have come as a shock to Rand. The doctor was a sour, abrasive man, 20 years her senior. Still, in spite of this, the relationship moved quickly. She sued for divorce and married Crandon a few months later, leaving Rand in obscurity. Once married, the Crandons established themselves as a Boston power couple. They threw lavish parties and entertained society's elite with dinner and cocktail receptions. But behind the scenes, their relationship was a mess. Mina tried to be the perfect wife, but Crandon was difficult to please. Arrogant and as charming as a wet dish towel, he was just as capable of sucking the air out of a room as she was to light it up. He certainly didn't make the adjustment any easier. Her new status could always be taken away. He reminded her of it constantly. 2 ex-Mrs. Crandons came before her, and she would do best to remember that. So, Mina watched her figure and dressed well. She encouraged her son to call him Papa and pushed for a quick adoption. And she paid close attention to the smallest detail of the doctor's conversations in order to better mimic his beliefs and opinions. Like how religion was repugnant, man was no better than a piece of machinery, and death loomed around every corner. Perhaps it was this deep-seated obsession with mortality which led Crandon to behave the way he did, and perhaps project his insecurities upon his new wife. Even if therapy had been available in the day, it's doubtful he would have sought it. He seems much more the type that grins, bears it, and then takes it out on those around him. And without a better option to support herself and her child, I can't say that I'd blame her. History doesn't record a happily ever after for either of his exes, so it's safe to say they met a fate similar to Rand's. It also wouldn't be the first time a woman bent over backwards to accommodate a man, would it? In 1923, the doctor followed modern trends and became interested in spiritualism, particularly in psychic research. Mina had very little interest in the field and probably didn't know the first thing about the occult at all. But when Crandon began to experiment with seances and the mediums who performed them, all women whose parlor games bordered on horror and burlesque, she probably felt like she had to go along. Sitting for one of these sessions, a medium told Mina that she had innate psychic abilities of her own and sensed the presence of a young man around her, trying to reach out. It's easy to see what happened here. It was a case of mistaken identity. The doctor's medium presumed that the young trophy wife was the real believer, who talked her much older, probably more skeptical spouse into participating. So she turned her attention to what must have appeared to be the easier mark. Crandon, with an overinflated opinion of his own intellect and an equally negative impression of everyone else's, undoubtedly thought his own powers of deception were the culprit, and likely played along so as to observe. Now, if you've been listening to the show long enough, and if you haven't, you really should, you'll recognize the mentalist tricks at play here. This is an example of 2 techniques, Barnum statements and cold reading. A Barnum statement is something that sounds personal and specific, but in reality is empty flattery. The key to this kind of mental manipulation is to stage things in an intimate, secretive manner and allow the subject to define the meaning themselves. Using descriptions like innate makes it easier to avoid easily detected lies and makes the affirmation all the more enticing, even when there's no reason to believe it's true. Claiming to sense her psychic powers was a way the medium could pull in her young mark, so she could then work a cold read. Cold reading is a technique that begins with vague, general statements that are subtly or dramatically refined based upon their subject's reaction. Hence the introduction of a young man trying to contact her. Who doesn't know a young man? Later retellings of this story claim the young man was identified as Mina's dead brother Walter. But in the years following the Great War, there would have been plenty of young men to choose from. And as the only one able to see the invisible specter, it was risk-free. The medium would never be admonished for asking more questions. And the more questions answered, the easier it would have been to discern the mark's desires and act accordingly. But unlike most people sitting for a talented mentalist, Mina must have caught on, because she soon suggested she and Crandon hold rituals of their own. On a quiet evening in May of that year, friends and colleagues gathered at Lime Street for a home circle. Under the glow of candlelight, the group joined hands around a small table and attempted to contact the spirit world. They took turns asking questions, many of which were answered with silence, until in response to one sitter's question, the table tilted. Then it tilted again, and again, and again. Crandon immediately took control of the group and set out to identify the source of the spiritual phenomena. Falling back on what he knew, he relied upon the process of elimination, directing each member of the party to leave one at a time until the paranormal activity ceased. The table stopped jerking when Mina stood. The doctor crowed at his discovery, his very own wife, a powerful medium. And Mina succeeded in duping her first sitter. It's easy to discount the women involved in the spiritualist industry as grifters, and some admittedly were. But to do so would be to completely ignore the societal constraints suffered by all women of their day. Mediumship not only provided women with authority, prestige, and financial independence, but it also gave them a powerful stage, one traditionally held by magicians and the clergy, who were typically men. It also capitalized on society's preconceived notions. Even among the scientific and medical communities, women were seen as inferior, weak, helpless, and addle-brained. Entertaining ideas that a woman could be an illusionist, contortionist, or scam artist were just as ridiculous as the possibility of a dog flying to the moon. And if the powerful men who occupied these positions refused to accept a woman capable of fooling them, is it really her fault if she does? As astounded as he was, Crandon wasn't in the dark for long. Mina truly loved him and would never risk her lifestyle and stability by playing him the fool. And if he was offended upon learning the truth, he accepted it pretty quick. She was a talented performer. And more than that, she was popular. It didn't matter how she did it. Crandon could see her new reputation came with lots of perks. And as her star rose, so did his. The couple began hosting similar events regularly, by invitation, of course, due to Crandon's lofty position. In reality, the limits served to reduce access to detractors and foster scarcity. High society members of Boston's upper crust loved that kind of thing and were frequent attendees. Also on the guest list were the doctor's colleagues at Harvard and VIPs among the spiritualist societies, who were equally amazed by her display. Mina's seances were an event in themselves. Sitters didn't just watch her go into a trance. They got it all. They heard raps, felt breezes blow past them, tables tilted, and mysterious music played out of nowhere. They heard ghostly voices, saw apparitions, witnessed trance writing in multiple languages. Furniture around the parlor moved without explanation, and clocks stopped on the very walls where they hung. If that wasn't enough, she passed a live pigeon through a solid wall. Those last few were probably imagined, but after having their psyches and senses overloaded for about an hour, do you blame them? Those sitters also fell victim to a common phenomena we still see today: bias. While it comes in many latent forms, they all have two things in common. No one sees them coming, and they jack with our ability to recognize the truth. When it comes to bias, there's a lot to unpack here. First and foremost is anchoring bias, the tendency we all share to take the first piece of information we learn about a subject as fact and base every other decision about that subject accordingly. Most of the general impressions of the Crandons are good examples of this. Dr. Crandon was a Boston staple since his family traveled to the New World on the Mayflower. His pedigree, wealth, and position in the community had a reach far greater than the couple themselves. Hardly a man or woman in the city wouldn't have been familiar with them, cultivating a lot of initial impressions from which to set a mental anchor. Then there's the tendency to shape our general impressions based off of a single trait. This is described as the halo effect. Even if an observer had never heard of the Crandons, which, like I said, was unlikely, Mina was a striking beauty, and we naturally associate beauty with charm, grace, and innocence. This is doubly true if one is doing his thinking with the brain found below the belt. There's a good reason we call it a penis and not a polygraph. That leads us to cognitive bias, when our values influence our judgment and our ability to interpret information. Dr. Crandon was a prestigious surgeon and an esteemed member of Harvard academia, and he never let anyone forget that. Even if what he said was complete nonsense, few would dismiss him. Instead, they would have been inclined to doubt themselves and presume he knew something they didn't. And why not? He was upper class. Didn't that make more sense than suspecting he was a self-indulgent wacko? Even in these formative years, Mina's tendency to follow trends served her well. She turned her razor-like attention to detail towards other mediums of interest to her husband, looking for qualities and practices to adopt and elevate. Every practicing medium had a spirit guide, a possessing spirit to do the talking while the medium was supposedly in a trance. So she resurrected the memory of her dead brother and gave him the job. It worked well with the biases. Relatively unknown, she was free to depict him any way she wished. In order to distinguish herself and her spirit bro, Mina portrayed Walter with a coarse, gruff manner, unlike Crandon himself. Confrontational and laced with profanity, it was strikingly similar to her husband's view of the common man, and ironically was precisely what spectators found so convincing. He didn't act like a heavenly being, so he had to be real. Then she removed a few things from her act as well, namely her clothes. Her seances became a spectacle, erotic and risque, even by today's house party standards. Under the guise of transparency, Mina often held her seances in the nude, where she threw herself into the laps of male participants, rolling around with her breasts heaving in a kind of Victorian lap dance. And her husband didn't object. He encouraged it. With her husband enthusiastically looking on, sitters were distracted, to say the least, especially when ectoplasm materialized from her vagina. While some mediums were content to make a modest living, engaging in the occasional study while avoiding too much attention, the Crandons pursued it. The doctor was particularly proud of his wife's gifts, boasting about her as if he were in a locker room. He even circulated his wife's nude photographs, distributing them to guests and psychic researchers like playbills. The more graphic ones, he cited as evidence, inviting researchers to come see his discovery for themselves. Mina was delighted to be Crandon's social goldmine. Finally, she'd earned his esteem. She went from being wife number 3 to his wife. It was great. And the associated street cred was irresistible. The only thing better than showing her off in Boston was showing her off in Europe. So the couple traveled across the pond, where Mina held seances in Paris and London. They were a great success. Several participants claimed to see psychic phenomena. During a sitting for the British Society for Psychical Research, she levitated the group's fraud-proof table under what they considered the strictest controls twice. Although there is little to describe what those controls may be, and far less than was used to describe Mina's state of undress. So there's that. Soon after their return, Harvard's psychology department came calling. The doctor was overjoyed. The blonde witch of Lime Street had arrived. The first formal investigation of Mina's mediumship was conducted in 1923 by a team of professors William McDougall, Hereward Carrington, Eric Dingwall, and J. Malcolm Bird, a rising member of the American Society for Psychical Research, the ASPR, and editor for the Scientific American magazine. The committee aimed to put Mina through intense experiments, but it was soon clear who controlled the study and who was just a mouse. Over the raised eyebrows of his team, Dingwall insisted on personally conducting all strip searches of the medium and that Mina remained undressed throughout all experiments. He then added to the cringe factor when he pulled out a vial of luminous powder and applied it to her body, paying particular attention to those parts which heaved, quivered, or twerked. While each could be loosely accepted as an attempt to ensure scientific integrity, kinky as it was, the team quickly grew suspicious when he also insisted upon undressing her. When he began interrupting the sessions frequently to reapply the powder, they called him out as a perv. But it's not like his buddies had any room to talk. They were just as compromised as he was. During the study, Crandon fronted Carrington the seed money needed to start his own psychical research laboratory, a sum too large for him to ever repay. If that wasn't enough, Mina allowed him to seduce her, and the two started an affair. Bird was infatuated with her as well. Although Mina found the dull, toady researcher gross, she wasn't above stringing him along, and it paid big dividends when it came time for him to compose the team's final report. After 5 months of faked orgasms, funding, and fluorescent powder, the team was no closer to securing reliable data than when they began. What was worse, most of the phenomena they did observe was clever, but clearly fraud. But the Crandons didn't feel that way. They came out on top. They had managed to save face, social, and spiritualist triumph. Whether due to their feelings for the medium or their relationships with her husband, the researchers didn't say a word. They didn't dare. Carrington even went on record saying, quote, "As a result of more than 40 sittings, I have arrived at the definite conclusion that genuine supernormal phenomena frequently occur. Many of the observed manifestations might well have been produced fraudulently. However, there remains a number of instances where phenomena were produced and observed under practically perfect control. And the others considered her for a prize." We'll pick up the story next week. This has been The Haunted Hustle. Thanks for listening. The Haunted Hustle is an original production of Toil and Trouble Media. Executive produced by Jennifer Beck. This episode was also written and performed by Jennifer Beck. I'm kind of a big deal. Additional production assistance was provided by Erin Iris, and our music was by Kevin MacLeod, Light Saturation, and the Schizoid Nightmares. Thanks, guys. If you've enjoyed our podcast, and I really hope you do, be sure to subscribe to your favorite podcast provider and follow us on social media so you'll never miss an episode. And give us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Heck, give us a 5-star rating on all of them. We can use all the stars we can get. And help us spread the word. Tell your friends about our show and its totally bingeable content. Tell your spirit guides too. We're not picky. And if you want to help us bring even more Toil and Trouble to the world, check out our merch and our Patreon pages. We have a link at toilandtroublemedia.com, or you can find it on Patreon itself. Just look for a sign. Well, it's the owl, but close enough. And as always, thanks for listening.